Welcome everyone to this neurobox how-to webinar. My name's Donna and I'm part of the neurobox team. It's great to have your company. I have shoulder length brown hair and I'm wearing a grey neurobox t-shirt. So today we're going to explore with the brilliant Mark Woodward how to have challenging conversations as a line manager. But before we get started, I just wanted to go through some housekeeping with you as we use Zoom today to share our wisdom with lots of you who are joining us. It's great to have your company. So please be aware that there are caption feature on Zoom. So in order to enable that, please select it, and then along with what we're going to share with you, you'll be able to have the captions along the way as well. Please do place yourself on mute, and that's greatly appreciated. Thank you in advance for that. It just makes sure that we can all enjoy the session together with undisturbed words of wisdom from Mark. Now, if you want to ask some questions along the way, and we really hope that you will, please use the Q&A box that you should see along the bottom of the screen. But we would also like to get the conversation going as well between ourselves. So there is also a chat facility within Zoom. We'd love to hear from you, and yeah, let's get the conversation started around some of the issues that we're going to share. We'd also love to hear where you're from today, so it'd be great to read all the different locations. So it's a big hello from me. I'm here in sunny North Wales. Beyond that then, I'm going to give Mark a great introduction. So let's get started with this. It's a real honour to work with Mark Woodward. We can think of nobody really better placed to take us through this session. Here at Neurobox, Mark is Head of Occupational Delivery. He's a Neurodiversity Specialist and also a disability specialist. And I'm sure he's going to talk about some of that journey as he talks us through today. He's a coach supervisor and an assessor as well. And as I say, I can think of nobody better to take us through this how-to webinar. So Mark, hi, thank you so much for the work you've put in on this session. I've had a sneaky peek and it's brilliant. So can I hand over to you? And I can see in the chat we've got hi from everyone. Hi everyone, it's lovely to have your company. But we're going to hand over to Mark now and really get stuck into this brilliant session. Mark, over to you.
Brilliant, thank you. And morning, afternoon, not sure, but hello everyone, and thank you for that introduction, Donna. I will try very hard to live up to that. Because Donna gave a visual description of herself there for our visually impaired listeners as well, I will do the same. Donna described herself as having long brown hair and a grey Neurobox t-shirt. I do not have long brown hair. In fact, I don't have any hair, but I do have a Neurobox grey t-shirt on as well. Okay. So, as Donna said, please feel free to sort of put comments in the chat, questions in the Q&A. Donna's going to keep an eye on those as we go along. It's great when we can make these things more of a conversation than a lecture. So yeah, as I said, please feel free. But let's jump into this now. So by starting off with, again, we know why we're here, but it's about having difficult conversations, specifically as a line manager. Now, managers are faced with all sorts of challenges in today's workplace, and especially when we're talking about sort of managing and working with disabled, neurodifferent team members as well. So yeah, managers need to know about neurodifferences. What is ADHD? What's the difference between dyslexia and dyspraxia? All that type of stuff. We need to be able to identify and sort of manage support for our team members, and it's always very individual support. So again, we need to work out what that looks like. We need to understand the Equality Act and reasonable adjustments. And all of this is usually on top of our day jobs as well. We still have to manage teams and meet targets and so on. That's a lot of understanding, of knowledge and pressure on people, line managers. Line manager training and Neurobox, we offer line manager training, is a great way to help people, managers, to get to grips with a lot of this. But one of the things that comes up an awful lot, and probably one of the more difficult aspects of this whole thing, is the conversation side of things. It's about having those challenging conversations. So for the next sort of 30 minutes or so, we're going to have a bit of a deeper dive into those difficult conversations. Okay. So let's start off by saying, well, what do we mean by a difficult conversation? Typically, difficult conversations usually involve us having to pass information or tell somebody else something that actually they probably don't want to hear. It might be where we need to negotiate a solution or a resolution. It might be where we actually need a specific outcome. We're going into this conversation knowing that we need to get a specific outcome. It might be where we have to discuss a sensitive topic. Again, we're sort of framing this conversation, if you like, in the context of disability and neurodiversity. Very often quite sensitive, triggering conversations around there. Sometimes a difficult conversation can involve all of the above. So many different types of difficult conversation, different situations where those sort of awkward type conversations need to happen. Why is it important as managers that we do get good at this? Because it is a skill. Having these challenging conversations skillfully, empathetically, is a skill. Very often, having that conversation is the gateway into understanding situations on a deeper level, which can often bring sort of underlying issues to light. So having a difficult conversation about someone's performance, for example, if it's done skillfully, if it's done empathetically, can perhaps bring forward a deeper conversation about that person is actually struggling because they have a disability that needs to be supported. Being able to have those conversations skillfully can avoid an awful lot of escalation. If a manager can have that conversation and get it right first time, very often things like HR departments don't need to get involved, complaints aren't made, misunderstandings don't have to be worked through. All of those things tend to go away when managers feel confident and are skilled to have these difficult conversations. So it's a really important skill. Let's take a pretend scenario. Okay, so we're going to meet Robin. Robin works as a data analyst. I have no idea what a data analyst does, by the way. And he's been with his company for about a year. All right. Now, the company has a hybrid working arrangement, but there is an expectation, which is relatively normal these days, that employees need to work from the office at least so many days a week. In this case, it's 2 days a week. Okay, not unusual. Now, the issue at the moment is that Robin I can't get the words out, rarely meets the requirement of working in the office 2 days a week. And when he does, what tends to happen is that Robin will book a quiet room to work from. So essentially, Robin, even when he's in the office, is still working remotely. Other members of the team have also complained that Robin can be quite rude sometimes when communicating. And Robin's manager, Chris, let's make up another name, Chris, has also noticed some of this behaviour as well, and actually has experienced himself that Robin can be quite difficult to have a conversation with. So that's where we're at. So it falls on Chris to address this with Robin, which involves, what are those difficult conversations? So in the first scenario, take one, the conversation goes a little bit like this. So to start with, Chris is very anxious about having this conversation. It's not something Chris is comfortable with doing. It's not something he's got a lot of experience of. And, understandably, he's quite anxious about going into this. But Chris understands that he needs to be very clear about what the problem is and what the expected behaviour is. So actually the problem is that you're not coming into the office 2 days a week. And when you do come into the office, you're not collaborating with your colleagues. Very clear about the problem. And he recites the expected behaviour. You're expected to be in the office and work with the team 2 days a week. Chris also explains about the conversations and the style of communication, and explains to Robin that actually people are noticing he can be quite rude, and the expected behaviour is that you need to be respectful to your colleagues. So Chris is quite pleased about the fact that he's got this across nice and clearly. And Robin seems to understand. Robin even apologises and promises to try harder to make it into the office and to communicate more effectively. And overall, Chris feels that the conversation went quite well. They got the important points across, and that Robin has made a commitment to doing better. Chris feels quite confident reporting back to HR that, yeah, you know what, this has gone okay. So sort of fast forward a few weeks, and what's the outcome of this? Well, the outcome is that actually Robin very quickly starts taking time sick. And when Robin is at work, Robin's behaviour hasn't really changed. In fact, he's probably got a little bit worse. He's probably retreated further back into himself. Very soon, Robin becomes so stressed and anxious that he signed off for work, so long term. And ultimately, Robin ends up resigning from that role. Let's rewind and let's have that conversation slightly differently. So take 2. This time, Chris actually takes time to create an atmosphere, if you like, a safe space in which to have this conversation. So that when Robin sits down for this conversation, there is a feeling of safety, okay, and that they're going to be listened to. This means that actually quite quickly, Robin feels comfortable discussing some of these challenges with Chris, and explains that actually, you know what, one of the reasons that I don't come into the office as often as I should is because the office feels really, really noisy. It's chaos, it's hectic. It's actually quite painful for me. And also, not only that, but getting here is really hard work. Okay, I've got to catch 2 buses and a tube, and by the time I get to the office, I am exhausted. With regards to the communication style, Robin actually explains that he finds it quite difficult to know what to say to people. The small talk is really, really challenging for him. So his way of dealing with that is to sort of minimize those conversations, keep conversations when I have to have them as short as possible. Okay, use as fewer words as possible. That way, there's less chance of me putting my foot in it, saying something inappropriate, looking silly. Okay. And Robin also shares that actually when he was young and he was going through school, he was told that there was a chance he might be autistic. The outcome of this conversation is that actually Chris is able to discuss with Robin the types of things that they can do to support him. Chris arranges a workplace needs assessment. A workplace needs assessment is where an expert in a particular disability will spend time with an employee, understanding that person's role, challenges, strengths, and then making suggestions to the organisation for adjustments that could be put in place to support that person. So Chris arranges time for this. Another quite important note on that point is that Chris is able to arrange a workplace needs assessment for Robin because Chris's organisation has a process, has a policy in place to do that. Consequently, those adjustments are explored with Robin, and they're implemented. And the outcome is that Robin is able to continue in the role and actually becomes a very valuable member of the team. All round, a much better outcome. So how did Chris do this? Okay, well, we're going to break this having a difficult conversation down into three areas. Okay, we're going to look first of all at the sorts of things we can do before the conversation even takes place. Then we're going to look at the sorts of things that we can do during the conversation and then after the conversation. Okay, so managing a difficult conversation, giving a conversation the best chance of going well, starts well before the conversation. Okay. I think probably one of the most important things that we can do as a manager is to be very clear about what we'd like that outcome to be. What's the difference between this conversation having gone well and having not gone well? Okay, and I think we need to be realistic. So rather than setting the goal of the conversation to be, I need to sort this situation out, actually, let's be realistic. Maybe the goal of this conversation should be, I need to understand what's causing this situation. So be realistic about what a good outcome is going to be. One of the challenges with having difficult conversations is that nobody likes having difficult conversations. So the last thing we want to do is stand up having 2 or 3 difficult conversations. So very often we will put unrealistic expectations on this one conversation, because if I can get it all sorted out now, I won't have to do it again. But actually sometimes that can make it even worse. Be realistic about what the expectations are going to be. Think about the time that you're having this conversation, the time of the week, the time of the day, okay? So, for example, having it first thing Monday morning is probably not going to be good for many reasons, not least because Monday mornings are never great for anybody, but it also means that if I know I've got this meeting coming up on a Monday morning, I'm going to be anxious the whole weekend, and not just the employee, but the manager as well. Okay, and by the time Monday morning comes around, I've probably built this thing up into something massive. Similarly, if it's at the end of the day, the employee may think of questions after the conversation, but then they'll have to hold on to them until the next day. And that could be a source of stress for that person. Again, they may well be worrying about that all night. Is there a time that both of you are likely to be more open? Is there a sort of a time in your working week that you both might have a time that a conversation like that would be more comfortable to have? So there are no right or wrong answers around when's the best time to have this conversation, because it depends on the organisation, the role, and so on and so forth. But it's a really important thing to think about. Okay. What would be ideal, what would be great is, as the manager, if you don't know when the best time would be, possibly ask the employee, is there a good time for us to have this conversation? But think about it. Along with the best time is actually the location. Where are you going to have this conversation? The location of these conversations can very often set the tone for the conversations. Okay, most of these conversations are likely to happen remotely now, Teams or Zoom or something like that. But although that might be the default, actually, is it the most appropriate? Is this a conversation that is worth actually having in person? Okay. Think about where that conversation takes place. Finally, when we're talking about preparation, we need to be mindful of any of our own unconscious biases. Okay. Now, Unconscious biases is something that we've probably all heard of, and I'm sure we've got different understandings and levels of understanding about it. But just to sort of give everybody a bit of a recap around what I mean by unconscious bias. Okay, unconscious bias is where we, as humans, make assumptions about things without thinking about it. And these assumptions are always sort of based on our experiences of our life and our own programming and all those sorts of things. And it's a survival mechanism that has been built into us. As I said, it's a time-saving technique that our brains use essentially to keep us alive in dangerous situations. It's the reason why, if you are, I'm trying to think of a scary situation now, if you're walking down the street at night and you see somebody running towards you with a knife in their hand, your unconscious bias takes over and your brain will assume that this is a dangerous situation and that we're not going to hang around. Okay, what isn't going to happen is that your usual critical thinking, questioning, curious brain isn't going to be allowed to ask silly questions like, I wonder if he wants to talk to me. I wonder if he just really likes his knife and wants to show it to me. We are not going to get the opportunity to ask those questions because our unconscious bias takes over. Our survival brain kicks in and we make an immediate reaction based on all of our previous programming and experiences to that date. All right. And it's not a fault. We wouldn't be here without it. Unfortunately, it's designed, as you can imagine, for sort of life or death type situations. And it's not always that useful in everyday situations. It can cause us to fall back on stereotypes and cliches, which means we jump to the wrong conclusions. So as a manager, when you're talking to an employee and you notice that that employee is fidgety, okay, they may be playing with their pen a lot. They may not be looking at you. They may be looking around the room, sort of not making eye contact. Our unconscious bias is likely to tell us that person's not listening to you. Okay, they're not interested. And our natural reaction to that is perhaps to become a little frustrated. Perhaps even to say, look, this is important. You need to listen to me. Okay. What your unconscious bias isn't going to tell you is that maybe that person has ADHD. And actually, they are trying really hard to listen to you. And the reason they're fiddling with their pen and looking around the room is because this is actually how they focus on what you're saying. So we need to be mindful of what our unconscious biases are. We need to be mindful when they happen, because when we go into these conversations, they are going to play a part, and we need to make sure they're not dictating the outcome of the conversation or dictating our actions. It's not easy to do. We can't turn this off. If we could turn it off, we probably wouldn't be here today. So it's always going to be there. But the best we can do is just be mindful that this thing exists, that this is how our brains work, and keep asking ourselves the question, could there be another reason for this person's behavior? Okay. There's a really interesting quote, which I've put on the bottom of this slide here, which is, the first thought that goes through your mind is what you've been conditioned to think. It's your unconscious bias. What you think next defines who you are. Okay, so we can't turn that unconscious bias off, but we can get used to catching it. Okay, so when we're thinking about preparing for a conversation, these are the sorts of things that can make a big difference as to how that conversation goes. All right. During the conversation. So what sort of things can we do during the conversation to make this, I'm not going to say to make this a good conversation, because the reality is that you can do everything right and things can still go wrong. Okay. Having challenging, difficult conversations is difficult, believe it or not. So none of this is going to guarantee it's going to go right, but it is going to give you a much better chance of it going well. So during the conversation, listening is probably the single most important thing that we can do. And it sounds really simple, but it's actually really hard. Okay. Listen more than talk. There's a saying I was told a long, long time ago that human beings have got 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. We're meant to listen twice as much as we talk. And I like that. That stuck with me. Give time for the other person to respond to questions and without interrupting. And that can be really difficult because actually human beings don't like silence in conversations. When there's a quiet period or nobody's got anything to say, we suddenly feel the need to fill that silence. But actually, sometimes that's really important. And again, if we're talking about certain neuro differences, for example, perhaps ADHD or autism, for example, that person may need time to think about the answer, may need to process that question. Okay. And actually, that might look differently for different people. Sometimes someone with ADHD may do an awful lot of talking without actually answering the question, because very often people with ADHD will process their thoughts out loud. So it's really important that we recognize that and give time for that other person to answer those questions. Listen to what they've got to say without interrupting or dismissing their feelings. Okay. Another really nice little tip is to paraphrase back things that they say to you. Okay, just repeat back what they've said in your own words. Ask some clarification questions, clarifying questions. Yeah, I think I've used up all my words for the week already. Sorry about that. This can show that you are actually listening to them, and that can go a really long way. Knowing that you're being heard in a conversation is so important. But also it genuinely helps you to understand what they're saying. So listen, give time for that person to respond, and paraphrase back. Actively listen is what that's called. Okay? That's probably the most important thing that you can do. If you listen, generally speaking, it will go okay. The other thing to bear in mind is that the words we use make a big, big difference. Okay? Using I statements can be a great way to go. So for example, the example I've got here, I feel concerned when deadlines are missed. I worry when you don't take notes in the meeting. Is much more powerful than you're rubbish at taking notes in the meetings. You should take more notes. You always miss deadlines. Okay. So using I statements to frame what you want to say can be quite powerful. Again, I don't want to give the impression that all this stuff is easy. It's not. Okay. It takes practice. Stay focused on the issue again, and this goes back to that preparation part that we were talking about earlier. So that know why you're having the conversation. What is the outcome that you want from this conversation? And make sure you stay focused on that issue. Try not to bring other things in, okay? So focus on the one specific thing. Otherwise, the conversation can very quickly sort of spin out of control. You end up having conversations about things that actually aren't relevant to what you wanted the conversation about. So again, direct that conversation. Keep an eye on where we are with this. Stay focused on the actual issue. Set boundaries. Sometimes these conversations can be very emotionally draining, emotionally challenging, can be triggering for some people. As the person who is, if you like, controlling this conversation, you need to keep an eye on that other person's state of being, if you like. Be prepared to call a halt to them, whether that might be a break or whether that might be let's reconvene at a later date. Let's give you time to go away and think about this and put some questions together, and then let's come back and talk about that. Okay, again, it kind of goes against our instinct because this is a really challenging and stressful situation. And the last thing we want to do is put ourselves in a situation where we've got to do it again. So the temptation is to try to get it wrapped up here and now, however difficult that might be. Try to avoid that. Okay, set those boundaries. Be kind. Sounds really, really simple. But again, I think this kind of goes back to the unconscious bias thing a little bit. It's really about, I suppose, giving people the benefit of the doubt. And it can be something as simple as making the assumption that we're in this situation because of a lack of understanding or training, rather than a lack of willingness to engage, for example. So take the kind thought path wherever you can. Being kind can make such a big difference. The other person very often will pick up on that sort of vibe, if you like, and sort of respond accordingly, which makes the whole thing a lot easier. Okay, acknowledge the other person's feelings. Let them know that whatever they're feeling actually is valid. And as I said, watch out for those unconscious biases. Just keep an eye on them. Okay, are we making assumptions based on anything that we're seeing here? Are those assumptions accurate? Be kind sounds really simple, but actually there's a lot wrapped up into that. Check in. Check in regularly with the other person and also with yourself. Okay, this kind of goes back to those setting those boundaries. Okay, is a break needed? Do we need a break? Okay, at this point, does the other person have questions? That can be a really important question to ask. Again, for some people with ADHD, for example, when questions pop up, it can be very difficult for that person to hold on to those questions. They kind of need to interrupt, get those questions out. For other people, they will hold on to those questions. But this is quite an emotionally charged situation. So something else is likely to come up. So those questions may get forgotten. Ask regularly whether there's anything they'd like to ask. Check in with yourself. Is the conversation on track? Have we started to spin off in a different direction? Are we losing focus here? What is the emotional state of the other person? What's the emotional state of me? Do I need a break? At this point, is there anything I need to be doing differently? How's this actually going? Do I need to change my approach? Okay, so check in with yourself. I've got collaborate down here because very often these difficult conversations are usually around trying to find a resolution to a situation. So if we go back to Chris and Robin, it was about trying to find a resolution to the situation that Robin was in, where he wasn't coming into the office, where he wasn't communicating effectively. Okay. Now, as a manager, it's quite tempting for us to just actually dictate what the behavior should be and what's expected. But things go a lot better if actually we can collaborate on these solutions, if we can involve the team member, the employee in the solutions. Okay, people become a lot more motivated about solving a problem if they feel part of the solution. So collaborating can be a really powerful tool. As a manager, do you know what? Actually, I've put down the situation. These are the challenges that we have. Okay, let's understand why those challenges exist, and let's work together to see if we can find out how we might work through those challenges. Collaborate, really important. Finally, when wrapping up that conversation, it can be really important to summarize what's been said. Okay, summarizing is a really powerful tool because it helps us as managers, but also, again, as I've said many times before, these are quite emotionally charged situations, and very often you, and most certainly the employee, are working in a state of stress at that time. And when we work in a state of stress, our brains aren't so good at the executive functioning type stuff, the critical thinking, the planning, the analysing. We become much more reactive and instinctual, a little bit like the unconscious biases. That can mean it can be quite difficult to keep track of how the conversation went. I'm almost definitely not going to be taking notes. So actually just rounding up what we've discussed, what we've agreed, can be a really, really powerful tool. Okay. Also summarizing, wrapping things up, can very often present the situation in a slightly different way to the employee, which may again prompt a slightly different way of thinking for that employee. It may invite additional questions, for example. Being very clear about the next steps, whatever they might be, whether that's reconvening for another conversation, or whether it's putting something in place, or whether it's agreeing that you as a manager will do something. For example, I've got to go away and see if our organisation has a workplace needs assessment process, for example. Okay, but be clear about the next steps. Those are both very important. And again, I would suggest probably even more important for employees, team members with neurodiversities. Okay, so for example, someone with dyslexia is almost definitely not going to be taking notes throughout the meeting. ADHD, autism, all those sorts of things, summarizing can be really, really important. Good. Okay. So I explained that I was going to sort of break this down into 3 sections. So we've looked at the preparation, what we can do before the conversation. And we've looked at the sorts of things that we might consider during the conversation. Finally, you'll be pleased to know, we're going to look at the sorts of things that we can do after the conversation. And it's not really that complicated, okay? So for you personally, as a manager, it's really important that you give yourself time to recover from this, okay? Do not have a meeting booked for directly after this conversation, okay? Make sure you give yourself time to just go and recover. Let it replay through your mind, okay? Somewhere quiet, allow that time for yourself. It's important that actually you reflect on that conversation. What went well? What would you do differently next time? Okay, what were you surprised at? Okay, what unconscious biases in hindsight do you realize that you were in there with? Okay, all those sorts of things. Reflect. As I've said before, this is a skill that gets learned over time. If it helps, talk it through with somebody else. In fact, I would say that's really, really important, actually. Just have a colleague that you feel safe talking this through. Okay, obviously we need to bear in mind confidentiality and things like that, but we can talk through the course of the conversation, how that person might have suggested doing something differently. Just talking it through can really, really help. Check in on the other person. Maybe the following morning. How are they feeling? Are they okay? Any more questions come to light since we spoke? Check in on them. Not only does that give a chance for the other person to ask any additional questions, but it also helps that to create that feeling, if you like, of safeness, of actually, this is an organization that does genuinely care about me. So it, again, makes everything that bit easier. I've got a slide here for too long, didn't listen. Okay, so I'm talking about summarizing. That's what I'm going to do here. All right, so if you fell asleep halfway through that, okay, the things to take away are: prepare for that conversation. Know what unconscious bias is and keep an eye out for them. And remember, you've got 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. All right, be kind. Everything's easier if we can be kind. Okay, collaborate on ways forward. Don't do solutions to people, do solutions with people. Okay, summarize. wrap things up, and follow up. Check in afterwards. How are you feeling? How did that go? And as I've put on this slide, and as I've said a few times already, this is a skill, okay? And having difficult conversations well is a learning process. Like any skill, it's gonna go wrong, all right? When things go wrong, ask what would have made this better? What could I have done differently? Okay. And as I've said before, when things do go wrong, don't beat yourselves up over it. Sometimes life is such that you can do everything right and things can still go wrong. Okay. What's important is that we have time to reflect back on this and make sure the employee, the other person, is okay. That's it. Thank you for listening. So we're going to have a few minutes now for sort of discussions and questions and so on, and I'll do my best to answer any questions that people might have. And then Donna's going to talk a little bit about some upcoming events that we've got going on as well. So what I'm going to do now is keep quiet, and I'm going to go over and say, Donna, have we had any questions in? I can see that we've got some chats going on. Is there anything that...
Yeah, we've, Mark, first of all, amazing. That was so insightful. We've got lots of folks saying thank you. It was excellent, brilliant. Because I feel like we don't get this guidance often as managers. And what you've done beautifully is take us through that step by step. Can I ask, for those who are asking about, this is brilliant, I want more, is this the type of information that you explore in, I know here at Neurobox we've got line manager training. Do you take folks on these types of journeys during those types of training that we provide?
So in an ideal world, yes. Okay, so our line manager training very much talks about having difficult conversations.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
But there's also a lot of other stuff that line managers need to be aware of and be comfortable with. So how much depth we go into is very often dictated by how long the particular client wants those training sessions to last.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
But yes, absolutely, it's a topic that is covered in our line manager training, yeah, for sure.
Brilliant. Brilliant. And for those wondering, yes, you will have the recording. Yes, you will have Mark's slides. Everything will be shared post webinar. Mark, for those who are managing folks, of course, who are neurodivergent, and a lot of people have come to us today because of that. That's one of our areas of expertise, of course it is. What happens if we're managing somebody who's not there yet in terms of talking about being neurodivergent? Do we start that conversation with the individual? Where are we at with that? So the person themselves is not, disclosed that they are neurodivergent. Maybe they don't even realize yet.
It's a really good question, and actually one that does come up quite frequently. For example, I've just been on an awareness course about ADHD, and I think one of my team members is ADHD. How do I approach that conversation with them? Yeah, it's really, really difficult. But I suppose, again, let's go back to the very beginning and talk about preparation. Okay, one of the first things we need to be mindful of and know is, well, why are we having this conversation? What's the outcome that we want? All right. If the outcome is to convince the person that they might be worth their time getting a diagnostic assessment or a diagnosis, okay, it might be worth talking about that. But I would suggest that actually the point of the conversation is to make sure that person's getting the support they need in their role. So it might not be anything, you don't have to frame that conversation around neurodiversity or disability. It can just be around, I've noticed that with these types of tasks, you seem to find it a little bit more difficult. I'd like to explore that. I'd like to work out how we can support you more with that. Can we have that conversation? It doesn't have to be about neurodiversity or diagnosis. Ultimately, what we want to do is find ways of supporting that person.
Brilliant.
So yeah, it doesn't have to be framed in that way.
Yeah, and we've got lots of people in the chat saying, so pleased that you're talking about this, because I think it's an area of confusion for a lot of us. When you were talking about when somebody knows one of these conversations has happened, so the employee, and then they're worried over the weekend and so on and so forth, how useful is it to really be as specific as we can in the prep? I loved what you talked about, you know, the preparing, the doing, then the afterwards. How useful is it if we said, look, we're going to talk about this, to take out maybe some of the, you know, the almost the mystery of what the conversation is going to be?
Yeah.
Is that useful part of the prep that we share that we're going to have this conversation about whatever that
Yeah,
might be?
absolutely. And I would say particularly for people, for example, with autism, for example, where actually things that are variable, things that can't be planned for, unknowns, if you like, can be particularly terrifying. Okay, so yes, being as specific about, look, we're going to be talking about this. Okay, I expect it to take about half an hour. These are the things that we're going to cover, can be a really useful way of doing that. Okay, but again, what I would say is maybe perhaps have that conversation with the employee first. Okay, because for some people, and I'm thinking personally here, having that level of detail would terrify me, quite frankly. It would give me some very, very concrete fears to latch onto, if you like. So again, it's very, very different for different people, but absolutely certain. For a lot of people, it can be really, really handy knowing the specifics, knowing what to expect. Okay, and that's one of the challenges of being a manager of a team of people, in that it's not easy to have ways of working that suit every team member. Okay, but as managers, in an ideal world, we'd have time to understand each of our team members and how they work best. It's not always that easy to do, but where we can, sometimes just asking the question can make life a lot easier.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Really insightful.
Good question, Donna.
We've got a question about managing volunteers. Is it a similar pattern? So if somebody's managing volunteers beyond employees, similar pattern if we do have to have these types of conversations with folks?
I think so. I think so. When we're talking about the things that we've been talking about, I mean, they should make any conversation with anybody a little bit easier, difficult conversation. So whether that's a volunteer or an actual employee, um, what might be different is the outcome of those conversations. Okay, so for example, things like the Equality Act may have slightly different rules for employees versus volunteers. My understanding, and please feel free to correct me, is that actually there is no differentiation. Whether you're a volunteer or an employee, you are still have the right to reasonable adjustment. So I don't think it's different, but please feel free to correct me if you can see something I've missed.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, Mark, because it's good practice. What you've shared here is a great practice to take somebody through what may be a challenging conversation in that way. And somebody had commented that it's been so useful, which is great to hear. And also, you know, they as a manager themselves, but of course they're managed too, and
Hmm.
they're neurodivergent themselves. So thank you for sharing that person. And yeah, I think the patterns remain the same. We just maybe, you know, maybe change them slightly depending on the folks that we're engaging with. We've got a question about the quote, that brilliant quote that you used about unconscious bias.
Yeah,
Somebody's asking, is it from the book Discomfortable? What is shame and how can we break its hold?
I will be entirely honest with you, right? I've known of that quote for a long, long time, and it's always resonated with me. And the quote is attributed to somebody called, and I'm going to pronounce it wrong, Nicola Cusa or something. And
Yeah.
I have done quite a lot of probably not very good research on that person, and I can't find anything. So if you do know of the original source, it's quoted quite a lot in different places, but I've struggled to find the original so- source to
Yeah.
attribute it correctly. So if that is where it's come from, thank you very much for letting me know that.
Brilliant. Well, that's a shout out. Let us know if you
Yeah,
can slot it in with whichever book. But when you shared it, Mark, a lot of folks in the chat said it's brilliant, really great
it
quote. It's
resonated with
really
me as well.
powerful, isn't it?
It is, because what it also does is it one of the things that happens when you become aware of your unconscious biases is that you start to beat yourself up for having those initial thoughts. Okay, I must be a bad person because I didn't consider this. But what that quote does is actually say, no, actually, that's okay. That's not you. That's your programming. What comes next is you. And that was quite a powerful thing for me.
It is. You'll absolutely love it. And the person who suggested in the book, please do keep in touch. Mark sounds like he's been on quite a hunt to find where it comes from. We'd love to have the definitive answer. We've got another question through, Mark, and please do keep them coming, everyone. It's great to hear you this afternoon. This person says, I'm about to start a new job, so huge congratulations to you from us here at Neurobox. But you wanted to ask how you let your employer know that you have dyslexia. So, Mark, a slightly different question about disclosure. Any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, this is always a difficult one because, obviously we want to say, well, of course you can disclose. You're protected. Why wouldn't you? But in the real world, it's not always quite that straightforward. Okay. But what I would say is that if you feel safe and comfortable disclosing, okay, think about again how you want that conversation to go. Okay, what is it that you're having the conversation for? Because actually, sometimes if you frame it correctly, it can be a really positive conversation, and it can actually sort of give you a chance to demonstrate your creativity, your problem-solving skills. And employers generally don't have any issues with people asking for support, especially if they know what support they're asking for. What's scary for employers is when they're presented with a problem that they don't know how to solve. So if you can go along and go, by the way, just to let you know, I have dyslexia, or I'm dyslexic. What that means for me is this, and the way that I manage that is by doing this, this, and this. Is that okay? Would the organisation be able to provide me with this to help me? That sort of conversation. So you're not just presenting it as a problem. It's a solution, and it's an opportunity for you to demonstrate your creativity and problem-solving skills. But again, I'm going to kind of preface that with, don't feel that you have to disclose. You do not. Okay. It would be nice to think that you're starting to work with an organisation where you feel safe having that conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. And for that person, please know that you're not on your own.
No.
You're part of our neurodivergent community in that way. So please do feel free to reach out to us. There will be some contact details when you get the recording, when you get the slides. Please do reach out to us because we're always just on the other end of a message to provide support. But huge good luck with some new adventures ahead and what hopes will be a brilliant new job for you. You'll be a great asset to your organisation with dyslexic problem solving and thinking differently, all the things that Mark's just said. Mark, I think that's it for the questions. And again, thank you so much for a really informative session. We had so many people saying thank you, and I can just echo that. I wonder then, whilst we're still chatting, brilliant, you've beat me to it. I was just going to ask if you could share what we've got coming up. Guys, we have got a really busy autumn here at Neurobox. And, I hope you've really enjoyed this how-to session. We've got some more coming through. So these are dates for your diary, but please do, have a look on social media and keep in touch with us to find out what we've got coming up. I'm just very quickly going to go through them. So on the 11th of September, we have Dr. Deborah Leveroy. She's going to be taking us through how to develop a neuro-inclusive policy. That's a great conversation, isn't it, on the back of what Mark's just been talking about. These topics all fit together really beautifully, actually. In October, then, on the 23rd, Mark, you're back with us again. This time you're going to talk about how to untangle a workplace needs assessment, and you've mentioned those today, haven't you? So that's a great session, folks, if you're not sure about what those assessments are. On the 20th of November, we've got Dr. Deborah with us again, and she's going to be talking about how to encourage the conversation. So for the person who's asking about how do I disclose and so on, that's probably a great session for you to join us. I hope you can join us for that one. And then on the 3rd of December, we've got how to champion your ERGs, and that's with me leading a discussion with other folks who've created those networks, how we can get the best out of them and really, celebrate our neurodivergent communities in our world of work. That just leaves me to say a huge thank you for your time. We hope you have found this session really useful. We don't talk a lot about these conversations, do we? And that's why it's been so brilliant to have this opportunity to share our wisdom in this way. Please do keep in touch with us here at Neurobox. We're always here to help, always happy to support the community that we serve. But thank you so much, everyone, and we hope to welcome you again in the not too distant future. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.